Today we take you once again back to sea to look at two major warships built by Italy at the beginning of the 20th century, which had a long and symbolically significant operational life. None like them, none like the battleship Andrea Doria, none like the battleship Caio Duilio. Twin ships built just before the outbreak of the Great War and destined to remain in service, with some pauses due to reconstruction needs, for 40 years. An extremely long operational life if you consider that generally the average lifespan of a battleship was 25, at most 30 years. Above all, these ships managed to be present in several theaters of war and to witness the transition. From a navy in evolution, still, however, heir to the glories of the Risorgimento and the era of broadside fire with large caliber guns, to a modern advanced navy based on aviation, first with mobile and then fixed-wing aircraft and on missiles. Witnesses of their time, witnesses to how war at sea has evolved and how technology has become indispensable in every field, including, of course, navigation. Today they are our protagonists, and we will tell you their story. The story of the Doria-Class battleships coincides with the transition from the Royal Navy to the military navy. Moreover, it marks that moment of the Royal Navy's greatest strategic ambition. We are talking about the period between the time immediately before the outbreak of the Great War and the Second World War. These great ships were designed when the Mediterranean was still dominated by an old theory, that of the decisive battle between large, armored fleets. As mentioned earlier, air power's significance was unimaginable, and guided missiles weren't considered. In the early 20th century, even major European powers didn't foresee this. This was shown in the video about the fruit revolt on the channel. The South American and North American powers, as we saw in the video dedicated to the fruit stack revolt, were engaged in a naval competition without precedent. The appearance of the HMS Dreadnought, a British ship that in 1906 brought the concept of the all-main gunship directly to the sea. The all-main gun concept had very quickly made every other type of battleship obsolete. The revolutionary idea of the new English ship, that is, concentrating offensive power in a uniform battery of large caliber guns, supported by turbines capable of ensuring high speed, had shocked the world. Italy, too, even though it was a relatively young nation, considered control of the Mediterranean a matter of prestige as well as strategic security. For this reason, Italy had decided to invest citizens significant financial resources as well as materials in technological research and construction. On the other hand, Italy, even though at the time it was part of the Triple Alliance with the Austro-Hungarian dual monarchy and the German Empire, saw the Austro-Hungarian Navy itself as its main rival, along with the French Navy, and both were modernizing their forces rather quickly. In this context, the figure of the naval engineer Vittorio Cuniberti emerged, a visionary theorist. He has been called the father of the HMS Dreadnought. He couldn't build it in Italy because the limitations due to the lack of resources didn't allow him to realize his dream. But that article written for the James Fighting Ship, a very famous yearbook and almanac that is read very carefully in military circles, had led the British to embrace his theory, a theory that would forever revolutionize warfare at sea. When the HMS Dreadnought arrives, which makes all the other ships present look outdated and of course quickly obsolete, even the Royal Navy starts shipbuilding programs to keep up. The first ship could be considered experimental. It's the Dante Alighieri. It's the first Italian all-big gun battleship. It's also the first warship to feature triple turrets, meaning 3 guns for each turret. However, the Dante Alighieri is not a definitive ship. It's also used to study the effects of that type of vessel on the sea. The following classes are those of the Conte di Cavour, which we discussed in another video available on the channel. It's precisely the Doria-Class that was created as a technical and tactical evolution based on the experience accumulated in previous years, a sort of improved version of the Conte di Cavour class. At the time, Italian designers tried to intervene by correcting some weaknesses of the previous units, increasing the crew, range, protection, and stability. The two new units, the Andrea Doria, named in honor of the great 16th century Genoese admiral, and the Caio Duilio, named in honor of the Roman commander who was the first to defeat the Carthaginians at sea. They were the response to the latest developments. The Doria was laid down at the Royal Arsenal of La Spezia in 1912. The Duilio, however, was assigned to the Castellamare di Stabia shipyard. When the Great War broke out, both ships were still being fitted out. They were large, elegant, and also relatively compact ships, a standard displacement of over 24,000 tons, an overall length of 176 meters. The engine system, based on steam turbines, allowed speeds close to 22 knots, which at the time were considered respectable. But the real heart of these ships was the main armament. As with the previous Conte di Cavour class, the Doria ships also had 13 305mm guns. The standard caliber for Dreadnoughts was 305mm. Those that mounted a larger caliber, like 343, 350, or 381mm, were called Super Dreadnoughts. As we were saying, those 13 guns were distributed in 5 turrets, 2 at the bow and 2 at the stern, both in a super firing arrangement, meaning with a triple gun turret at the base and a twin gun turret placed on an upper level, and then a 5th triple gun turret amidships between the smokestacks. This solution was the result of an attempt to maximize firepower without excessively increasing displacement. When Italy enters the phase of the First World War, the Great War, and does so obviously a year late because it waits for the right moment until the signing of the Treaty of London, the two ships are still under construction. The Caio Duilio is almost ready, while the Andrea Doria needs a bit more time. But naval warfare in the Adriatic turns out to be very different from pre-war expectations. The great battles between armored fleets, which had been imagined by strategists from all over Europe, are not seen in the Mediterranean. They will be seen in the North Sea, at Jutland, or in the Baltic. The Adriatic is a relatively narrow sea, easy to mine, and above all, easy to close off. And that's what happens with the blockade of the Strait of Otranto. Because of that blockade, the Austro-Hungarian Imperial and Royal Navy cannot enter the heart of the Mediterranean. It is forced to remain in its own ports, and on the rare occasions when it tries to break the blockade, it has to return home, often with considerable losses. The Italian and Austro-Hungarian battleships spend the war, basically, following the principle of fleet in being, serving as a deterrent in port, ready to set sail. Only the Austrians try to force the channel, but, as mentioned, they have to turn back after the sinking of the St. Istvan. The Royal Italian Navy maintains control of the main routes of the southern Adriatic, but even in that situation, the importance of new weapons emerges. Aviation, light assault craft, the MS, the very famous MS. It would be appropriate to ask ourselves the question,
sulla reale.
What about Italian battleships? But this question is postponed. After the First World War ended, the battleships remained in service with the Royal Italian Navy, which had basically lost little during the Great War. Of all the most modern ships, it lost the Leonardo da Vinci, the third of the Conte di Cavour class, which was sunk in port, reportedly due to enemy sabotage, but the rest of the fleet was basically intact. The 1920s were a period of relative calm. Doria and Duilio were still involved in various historical events, and the Doria, with its secondary guns, fired on the government building in Fiume during the Bloody Christmas to force, successfully, Gabriele D'Annunzio to surrender. And both battleships also took part in the expedition against the island of Corfu, firing at the fort, killing Greek civilians, simply to force the Greek government into humiliation. Towards Italy, which was demanding reparations and apologies for the death of some members of a border mission. In that period, we're talking about the second half of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s. the spread of military aviation, and especially naval and carrier-based aviation, began to raise doubts among the various powers. There are those who embrace and develop these doubts. Great Britain, the United States, Japan. There are those who experiment, like France, and there are those who prefer to look the other way. Italy, even though it had obtained the possibility to build aircraft carriers, refused. Instead, it adopted a wait-and-see tactic. Its old battleships were mothballed, put in reserve, waiting to decide what to do with them. Other ships that had been designed during the war laid down, but then abandoned. It's the Caracciolo-class. They were scrapped on the slipways. The lead ship, the Caracciolo, was launched as a hull. At first, they considered the possibility of completing her as an aircraft carrier, then selling her as a commercial investment. And finally, she too was dismantled. So, what should be done with those old battleships? Everything changes because of France. France, which in the mid-1930s not only modernized its old Bretagne-class battleships, but also launched an ambitious plan for new constructions. First, the battle cruisers, or fast battleships of the Dunkirk class, and then the large battleships of the Richelieu class. We already discussed the Jean Bart, and you can watch the video on the channel. While waiting to build the new Littorio-class battleships, and initially there were also plans for large battle cruisers, which were later set aside. The Ministry of the Navy asks for and obtains permission to rebuild the old battleships. First, it was the namesake Conte di Cavour and the Giulio Cesare, which were rebuilt from scratch to new designs, though several mistakes were made. Then comes the authorization to rebuild the Doria as well, a modernization effort among the most spectacular ever carried out. The work begins in the second half of the 1930s and involves such profound changes that the two old ships appear almost completely new. Hulls are lengthened, with the addition of a new bow compared to the old one. To improve nautical qualities, but also thanks to a proven, more efficient engine, the old boilers are replaced with modern systems, powered exclusively by fuel oil. The speed rises to about 27 knots. The armament is also transformed. The main guns, originally 305mm, are rebored and recalibrated to 320mm, taking advantage of the excellent resistance of the original weapons, which become more powerful, with greater range, but with less accuracy when firing. The central turret amidships is removed, so the main guns are reduced from 12 to 10, but this choice allows for an improved internal layout and increased operational efficiency. The secondary artillery consists of triple 135mm turrets, an excellent piece, but they are not able to provide effective anti-aircraft fire. That's why there are new weapons, new guns specifically designed for anti-aircraft defense, automatic cannons and powerful machine guns, which are placed exactly around the most vulnerable parts of the ship, the command tower and the two closely spaced funnels. This is because the Doria-Class ships show that, over time, after the mistakes made during the reconstruction of the Cavour class, technology has advanced and has identified the very vulnerable points of modern battleships. The reconstruction demonstrates the high level reached by the Italian naval industry. But yes, there is a but. Could those resources, financial and material resources, have been spent and directed in another way? It's a question that has been raised for almost a century now. What would have happened to the Royal Italian Navy if it had used the material and financial resources spent on the reconstruction of the Doria for building 2 more units? For example, other heavy cruisers, maybe a couple of escort carriers, everything that could have been useful in the Mediterranean War? We will never know. But when Italy enters the Second World War in June 1940, Doria and Duilio are almost ready to rejoin the fleet. At that moment, Italy has only 2 battleships, the old Cavour and Cesare. Doria and Duilio are undergoing sea trials. Littorio and Vittorio Veneto are also nearing completion. The war in the Mediterranean appears extremely complex. The primary role of the Royal Italian Navy is to protect the lines of communication with the African colonies, as well as to counter the British Royal Navy and initially also the French Navy. But all this is extremely complex. There is no clear strategy. The strategy remained anchored to the principles of the Great War, or even to principles that predate the Great War. Those of the great clash between surface fleets, without considering the use of air power, without imagining that new weapons would arrive. On the night between November 11th and 12th, 1940, the Royal Italian Navy discovered it was vulnerable. That night, Swordfish reconnaissance planes, launched from the carrier Illustrious, struck the Italian fleet anchored in the port of Taranto. 3 battleships were severely damaged. The Littorio took 3 torpedoes, but it was a modern ship. The damage was contained, and after a while, it could return to the fleet. The Cavour took only 1 torpedo, which sank her. Her recovery was difficult. The ship was taken to Trieste for repairs and upgrades, but she would never sail again. She would be sunk in port in the final days of World War II and later salvaged as a wreck. The 3rd ship hit is the Duilio, which is forced to run aground with a huge gash near the forward ammunition magazine. To avoid sinking at dawn, the ship runs aground on a shoal. The operations to refloat and repair the ship take 6 months. 6 months in which the Italian surface fleet, the battle fleet, is basically reduced to 3 ships. The modern Vittorio Veneto, the Giulio Cesare, which has already taken a hit at the Battle of Punta Stilo, and the Doria. Far too few. From that moment on, the operations of the Italian fleet become increasingly cautious. The lack of coordination with the Air Force, the absence of radar, and the growing shortage of fuel progressively limit the use of the capital ships. Between 1941 and 1942, the 2 old battleships continued to operate mainly as a deterrent force and with rare sorties at sea. All this changes in 1943, the fall of fascism on July 25th, then the armistice on September 8th. On that date, the Italian fleet receives the order to head towards Malta to surrender to the Allies. It's not a simple matter. We have already seen in another video what happens to the main battle fleet, the one that leaves from La Spezia and loses its flagship, the Roma, brand new, hit by a Fritz X, a German radio-guided bomb. Another squadron left from the Adriatic, from Trieste and Pola, including the old Giulio Cesare, which had been rearmed for the occasion. They even have to face an attempted mutiny on board. The last squad, the one that leaves from the south, from Taranto, from the Apulian ports, is the one that includes Andrea Doria and Caio Duilio. They managed to reach Malta without too many problems, under the command of Admiral Diazzara, the hero of Mezzo Giugno. In the following period, all Italian ships are interned. At most, some are used in secondary roles. The Kingdom of the South, as it was called, once it had obtained co-belligerent status, pushed to make itself count, to use the ships that remained in useful operations in the Indian Ocean. But the Italian ships are not equipped for the tropical climate. Some cruisers are detached, thinking of hunting down the German raider ships, but there are no more. They have all been sunk, and it's just a consolation. In reality, in Tehran, during the conference at the end of 1943, they also discussed the future division of the old Italian Royal Navy among the victorious powers. When the war ends, when Italy emerges destroyed, when the peace treaties are signed, the new navy is deprived of part of its strength. The modern Vittorio, Veneto, and Italia, the new name of the former Littorio, initially assigned to the United States and Great Britain, are demolished, but only after the barrels of the main guns are cut with a blowtorch. It's a small humiliation to endure. The old Giulio Cesare, as we've already seen in another video, along with the cruiser Duca d'Aosta and the sailing ship Cristofano Colombo, the near twin of the Vespucci, are transferred to the Soviet Union as reparations for war damages. Other smaller ships end up in France, Yugoslavia, and Greece. Doria and Duilio, on the other hand, are left to the new Navy, which is aware, however, that those ships no longer have any real military value. They are just beautiful ships to show off during cruises, and that's what they are used for. Training ships for gunners, for navigators, but without a clear operational use. For a few years, Doria and Duilio continued to fly the flag, taking turns as the flagship of the Italian Navy, until the mid-1950s, when both were decommissioned and destined for scrapping. With their disappearance, the era of Italian dreadnoughts comes to a definitive end. The Italian Navy, after all, was conceived by the Allies as a small Mediterranean extension of the Royal Navy. But that's not all, because those battleships left a well-defined historical legacy. Their long career spanned some of the most dramatic and significant moments of the 20th century, as we've seen in today's video. From a technical point of view, they represented a remarkable naval engineering achievement for the Doria ships, thanks to the Reconstruction, even though this raised legitimate questions about the actual effectiveness of such an operation in strategic terms. The Doria ships retained a special charm until the end, with a very beautiful modern design, attention to detail, and even some innovations, such as those in anti-aircraft artillery. They remained famous as battleships flying the Italian flag from beginning to end. The analysis of the Doria-Class allows us to understand the relationship between politics, industry, and military strategy in 20th century Italy. The construction of these naval units required huge investments, not to mention their reconstruction. At the time, battleships were not just military tools, but tangible examples of a state's technological capability and financial potential. In the Italian case, the Navy often played a role that exceeded the country's actual economic capabilities. The desire to maintain a modern battle fleet stemmed from the central geographic position of our peninsula, in the belief that the Mediterranean, the main strategic theater, constituted Italy's natural strategic space. In this sense, the Doria-Class represented one of the highest points of this immense effort for such a young, small country. The two units were, and the result of decades of shipbuilding experience and theoretical development. They combined elegance, design, offensive power, and also the ability to be modernized. And they left behind a small legacy. Just think that, after their demolition, Doria and Duilio continued to have a strong cultural impact, and not only because in 1956, interestingly, the end of another legend was also recorded, also called Andrea Doria, but it wasn't a ship, it was another legend.
sempre chiamata Andrea Do.
An ocean liner that sank, as luxurious as it was and considered unsinkable, after a collision off Nantucket with the Swedish ship Stockholm. In that 1956, while the other Andrea Doria was sinking, and while the battleship Andrea Doria, together with the Duilio, was being sent for demolition, another Doria and another Duilio were about to enter service. New guided missile cruisers that finally matched the choices of the Italian Navy with the needs of modern warfare. These two ships were given the war flags that belonged to the old Doria and Duilio, a passing of the torch, a historic transition, a generational change, from an old concept of naval warfare, based on large battleships, to a leaner, more modern, more up-to-date naval force, capable of meeting new needs, and to demonstrate that Italy, small, sometimes challenging, and with its modest resources, could always find good solutions and good compromises.